Let's kick it off. You'll first notice that the official garb today, I did follow it. It's the blue blazer with the white shirt and the tan pants. So I did get the note from Larry on what to wear. So I'm going to go over some exciting material here. It's all about what the state and fed people are doing to assist in the deployment of broadband. And there's two aspects to it. One is infrastructure access is one issue. I won't hit that much, but the states and feds are looking at that. And as we heard, the FCC passed some legislation on small cell so that you can get access, easier permitting, standard cost, and all that. The other part of it, though, is for most of us here, it's not an issue. But for many Americans in rural America, the deployment of broadband far exceeds the economic reality of deploying it. You wouldn't do it because it just costs too much. So we've had programs across the years to cross-subsidize that, and that's for any network, whether it's an electric network, road network, sewage network, water network. Any land-based network is expensive in rural America, and it comes down to linear density. I just don't have enough customers who use that network to make it economically efficient. So how do we get around that? And what's been done in the past is there's been internal subsidies. AT&T back before the breakup had cross subsidies that they subsidized rural service with urban customers. They charged urban customers more than it cost to help subsidize the rural customers. They charged businesses much more than it costs to subsidize residential. So as we've moved forward, the government stepped into that role to provide explicit funding, and that's really what I'll talk about here, what's going on. So on the state side, there is an excellent publication that was put out by Pew Charitable Trust mid-2019. And what they did is they surveyed all 50 states to find out, what are you doing about broadband? Tell us what legislation you passed, what funds you have set up. So it's an excellent document or a website to look at. It'll give you references to all the legal justification for everything. It'll give you their websites and all that, and I'll cover some of it. So if you think about what the states are doing for broadband deployment, there are those states that have funds specific to broadband. And you can see there's a big subsection of the country that has approached it and doing that. For example, New York State had a $500 million reverse auction for broadband deployment. The state of California is looking at, I think, at a $300 million fund. The state of Indiana, a $100 million fund. Many states across the country are setting up these funds and grants to encourage deployment in rural America. And it's really to help offset the uneconomic cost of deploying. There are other states that have funds that can be used for broadband, but they can be used for other purposes. There are old USF programs. USF is Universal Service Funds. Those provide benefit for voice service, so phone service. And that's really how these programs started on the telecommunications side, was all about phone service. Certain states have tax incentives, and others have some financing programs. So they may provide a loan, low interest loan to you. These latter ones are more of a marginal gain in rural America because the net economic deficiency between the investment that I put out and how much money I'll make is negative. And tax incentives can help you, but it doesn't make up for the fact that it's uneconomic totally, even with the tax incentives. So you just have to be careful on that. I've got the website for that Pew Trust document. I would recommend that you look at that. It's got examples. I mentioned the New York State auction is a $500 billion fund. Pennsylvania had a state incentive in which they incented during the CAF2 auction, which I'll cover real quick. They provided additional matching funds to try and encourage as many participants in the state of Pennsylvania for that CAF2 auction. So there's also a nice PDF document that sits out there that has kind of the office, the goal, the agency, and the fund that you can print out and carry with you if you're interested in that. So, one aspect, as I mentioned, of deploying in rural America and basically America is the financial side of it. The other part of it is I need access to infrastructure. And I need states to help sometimes because it becomes difficult, it becomes mired in local politics, it becomes mired in who actually owns that and will they actually provide access to it. So if you look at this, there are certain states that have come out with specific rules on pole attachments. Pole attachments are probably one of the biggest cost and biggest impediments to a competitive local exchange provider deploying fiber in an area. They simply can't get access to the poles. Or I can't even figure out who owns the poles. There is no national database on every pole in the country to say, I want to deploy in this area, I need to contact the pole owner. Well, who is it? There isn't a national database that says that, so they have to do research, they have to try and figure out who owns it. Then they have to contact that pole owner and figure out what the rates are. For telecommunications companies, they were regulated by the FCC. Electric companies have a different regulation as to the pole charges they can charge you on a monthly basis. But then there's a make-ready cost. And make-ready is basically the pole owner having to move facilities to make room for your cable. And sometimes that make-ready cost or time can be 6 months to a year to get access to the poles. And then the make-ready cost and all that cost incurred actually is a majority of the cost of deploying networks. So these states have attacked that. Permitting is another one. Los Angeles requires if you trench in the street, you have to pay 15 feet either side of the trench. Basically, they're getting the companies to pay for the repavement of the streets as they trench down and lay new cables. So some of this is looking at how can we control the permitting cost. Right of way. States and localities own a key asset. As wireline companies, cable, telecom, have to run cable. Typically, it's in a right-of-way. You need to get access to that right-of-way. And what do you pay for that right-of-way? Typically, it's free for many of the bigger companies because of the agreements they've entered into. But how do they get access to that? And our recommendation, we've worked with a few states, is if you really want to encourage deployment of broadband, you should not have charges for the right-of-way. This is right-of-way to utility poles that the city owns, or to the state highway. Anything that is a barrier to deployment is bad, and you really want to keep that barrier to deployment in rural parts of the country as low as possible. Any fees you charge raises that barrier. There's other states that have addressed other issues, such as microtrenching. Microtrenching is just a newer concept of how you trench down a street, maybe an 1 or 2 inch deep slot in the pavement or in a sidewalk or in the curb, and you put this vertical conduit system in. It's relatively less expensive. Well, it is less expensive than typical trenching in a downtown area, and it can save money. But there have been issues with microtrenching as far as when you repave, you might repave and rip up all the cabling, or the road shifts a little, and it just they've had some issues with it. Wireless facilities, I'll focus on small cell facilities. This is what we heard about is, how do you get access to the light poles? How do you get access to facilities that the state and city own to actually do this, and what are the permitting costs for that? Those permitting costs can be excessive. Actually, may actually exceed the cost of the equipment that you put on in some localities. And then finally, the last one is open access. Open access is where the state, if they deploy something, anybody's free to get onto that part of the network or onto that pole or whatever it may be, and they offer it through open access. Finally, we have to look at regulation of competition and just who regulates this industry. So the first one there is municipal networks. Many states have not necessarily banned, but really highly restricted deployment of municipal-owned networks. And a lot of it is actually from the lobbying of some of the companies in the room have successfully lobbied the state legislature to say, you can't have it. And it's, in part, it's logical. You don't want a government-owned entity which has tax benefits and whatnot competing against a commercial vendor to provide broadband service. But the problem we have is The companies have limited capital, and they typically hit the big population cities. They start at the top and start moving down. We got universal service and federal funding to help on the bottom up. It's the mid-sized cities, the small cities that kind of get left behind. And many times the only one that can step up is the local municipality to do that. And there's some good examples of muni networks that have been deployed. Regulatory authority, usually it's the PUC has taken up the regulation of broadband in the states. We have looked at, there are some new regulations on co-ops, so electric co-ops are probably one of the newest competitors in the field. And we'll see that as we get into the federal side. The electric co-ops are really taking off in the industry, and they're going to be openly competing with the AT&Ts, the CenturyLinks, the Windstreams of the world. Probably not the Comcast and Charter just because of the difference in operating footprints. So let's talk about the FCC side. The FCC provides a lot of money out to the carriers. It's not tax dollars, it's actually dollars that you guys pay into a fund. It's a tax that, or it's a fee that shows up on your cellular bill. It shows up on your AT&T bill, your CenturyLink bill. I don't know about the Comcast bill. I don't know if there's a universal service charge. Maybe, I don't think there is. Yeah, it's if you offer voice. The way it's raised is the FCC can only raise money on intra or interstate traffic. So it's always been lobbied against long distance charges. And that's really how it comes in. And the cellular companies, since they provide unlimited long distance across the country, are a big funder of the Universal Service Fund. This just shows you what parts of the country are funded from that. It's about $4.5 billion goes out annually from the FCC to help encourage and maintain broadband networks throughout the country. I pulled this off a USAC site. They have it through 2018. The 2019 report should be coming out soon. This just shows you the cumulative funding that's been provided by the FCC to these carriers through the various funds. ACAM is for rural carriers. It's the alternative cost, I forget my terms, alternative cost America model. Yeah, we actually, put a bonus in here. We wrote the ACAM model, so we kind of know what that does. Rural carriers were able to go under that fund if they wanted to. There's an Alaska plan that set money out specifically for Alaska because it has unique characteristics. The CAF2 fund is for all the price cap carriers in the room. Biggest recipient is Amy. She has received $1.9 billion since 2015 is when that CAF2 fund started. Next biggest recipient is Brendan. Brendan's received $1.3 billion from that fund. I'm not sure what Brendan has done with the money. We can ask him later what he's doing with it, so just to hold that out there. This CAF2 is what I'll talk about in a few minutes, which is called the RDOF Fund, Remote Digital Opportunity Fund, or Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. They will take that CAF2 money away from those carriers and put it out for reverse auction. So if you think about valuation, that has a fairly big impact on potentially the valuation of the AT&T network, the CenturyLink network, the Windstream network, because what's happening is, CenturyLink is getting about, I'm gonna say $600 million a year to make those rural areas economic. We're now getting that pulled away. Another carrier may come in, and we'll find out in a little bit, CenturyLink still may have to serve those areas. So does the network in those areas actually have any value? And that's a question that has to be addressed as we move forward when that auction takes place. The CAF BLS is for the intrastate access component of federal funding. We can talk about that if you're really interested. It's kind of a drier conversation than this presentation, so if you want to see that. And then the RBE is the Remote Broadband Experiment. The FCC looked at some experimental approaches to deploying broadband and how to fund it, and that's what those funds are. So the purpose of this Connect America Fund, or this $4.5 billion that is shifted out there, is to ensure that there are advanced telecommunications in rural, high-cost areas. And this was set up, this whole concept of the Universal Service Fund and providing advanced services back when we had dial-up modems. It was the 1996 Telecom Act actually kind of instigated this, and a lot of the rules and regulations were set up then to where we are today, which is a much different world from 1996. The major parts of that $4.5 billion, the price cap carriers through the CAF2 fund get $1.88 billion a year. That was for 6 years. It runs through 2020. They have the option to extend that for an additional year. I'm not sure why you wouldn't take that option, but they have the option to say, no, we're done with the money. We don't want any more. Then they have the rate of return for small telcos. The rural carriers get $2.3 billion. Mobility carriers get $500 million. They get that to actually for voice-based service. But what the FCC recently announced is they were going to try and redo that mobility fund. But Chairman Pai announced a new 5G fund. It's a $9 billion fund that will be made available to wireless companies for the deployment of 5G. So that is coming. And then the big one that happened in 2018 and actually started in 2019 was the CAF2 auction. They auctioned off $2 billion in total, which was about $200 million per year for a 10-year period. I'll hit the CAF2 auction. I know it's history, but this will give guidance to those who are interested in the RDOF auction, because the RDOF auction will basically follow a similar approach as the CAF2 auction. So basically, the FCC put out about 300,000 census blocks. Census block is a unit of geography defined by the Census Bureau. There's about 7.5 million populated census blocks in the country, so it's a small fraction. It was 1.4 million locations, and it's where the price cap carriers turned down funding. So AT&T turned down funding in Oklahoma, Missouri, and Nevada for the CAF2. They said, we don't want the money. And in part, they didn't want the rules and regulations that come along with that money, so they turned it down. Yeah, Gary?
Wasn't that 2015?
Yeah, it was 2015. Yeah, it was a 6-year program, and it finishes up at the end of this year, unless you take that optional year, which takes it to 2021. Yeah. So a reverse auction, actually, let me talk through it. I'll show you how it works, or a little bit. So it was the AT&T and mostly Verizon footprints that were turned down. There were some, I think, CenturyLink and Windstream properties that may have been turned down as well. And then it also took the very high-cost parts of the country. And they used their cost model, which, again, we may have written for the FCC to identify the high-cost parts of the country. So those were put into this auction, and they were auctioned off. It was going to be a $2 billion auction. In the end, $1.4 some billion was actually awarded out. The FCC was very pleased with it because they were able to get coverage out for cheaper than what would have been awarded out via the model-based funds. So basically on the reverse auction, it's a little different than some other reverse auctions, but basically what the FCC said is let's take the reserve or what the current blocks would need as funding to make them economic. So we ran the cost model for them. And in a census block, we might have said it cost $100 on average to serve the customers monthly. ARPU may be $52.50, kind of what the FCC came up with. So they said, we'll provide $47.50 of support in this block for the number of customers in the block. So that's the reserve level. The FCC said, okay, and we're going to start this auction. And anybody that's interested in taking the funds in that, put in a bid. And we're going to decrement down. So they started at, you actually get, I think, 190% of the funds offered, the reserve level. And what they did is they stepped it down 10%. So it went from 190, 180, 170, down to a point at which they spent their it was actually almost $2 billion, $1.96 billion. Once they had enough participants at the $1.96 kind of stepping down. Okay, you're going to get 48, now you're going to get 44. Carriers would back out, and once they got to the 1.96, they stopped the first round. And they said, okay, we've got to a point that the price that we're going to offer allows us to spend our funds and get support out. And then what they did on the second stage is they took those census blocks, actually census block groups, in which there are multiple competitors saying, I want that money. They then ran the auction between the two of them by, again, stepping it down. So they went from 80 to 70 to 60 to 50 to 40 to 30 until one of the participants said, I give, it's yours. What we found is in that auction, satellite actually was one of the biggest winners. Because satellite basically has no incremental cost other than the dish at your house, which they typically charge you for anyway. So they could step down the request for funds pretty much. And actually they took in some areas, I think as low as, I want to say 15%. It was a pretty low number of what the FCC was offering. They said, we'll do it for 15% of what you're offering. The FCC tried to make sure that they encouraged the deployment of higher speeds. So what they did is they had a weighted approach to this. So they said, if you're a gigabit provider, we will not penalize your bid at all. And you will get the full amount of funding in that block. So if, for example, there is $100 available in that block, and you're a gigabit provider coming in, I get the $100 irrespective, because I do not get penalized. However, if I'm only going to provide 100 megabits, I will only get $85. I have a 15% penalty applied to my bidding. So I'm already at a disadvantage. So it was meant to incent that we'll give more money to a fiber provider because that's what we really want, and we'll disadvantage the other providers. If you're offering the minimum, which was a 10-1 service, you were penalized 65%. So you started at $35. So you would get $35 while the broadband provider would get 100. So as you think about the economic model of trying to run this auction, all these bidders are in there trying to think about how much money do I need? What's the other carrier going to get? So it was actually a fairly good auction that the FCC is actually going to use for the new RDOF. So we'll talk about that. They did penalize latency. There's this thing called mean opinion score, or the MOS score, has to be greater than 4, because what this was for was not only broadband, but it was also for voice service. As a voice provider, you have to have a mean opinion score above 4, which basically means satellite providers can't do it. I think their maximal achievable score is 1.8, and it's because of the delay. And this is high orbit satellite service. But for some reason, they still were able to win a lot of footprints, and they claim their MOS is over 4. It's been an issue at the FCC, but I think they've adopted and said okay. So I'll just jump to the results. If you look at the states, not that you can actually see it, the biggest winner, Missouri, was the biggest winner in the auction. Reason for that was AT&T released all their CAF funds in the state, so it had one of the biggest eligible set of census blocks in that auction. The other part of Missouri, and I don't have it here, is the Missouri Electric Co-ops formed consortiums in the bidding and actually were very successful. So they were able to get a higher set of fundings versus Pennsylvania. Verizon turned down all their CAF money. Pennsylvania's up here. I think it's right here. You would think it would have been higher, but actually the biggest winner in Pennsylvania was Viasat. So Viasat bid the numbers down quite a bit, so the state didn't get as much money flowing in. From the speeds that were offered, not that you can see it, but the first bar is gigabit. So you can see that there was a lot of money offered to gigabit providers, then the baseline, and then above baseline is 25 megabit. There was some minimum, which was the 10-1 speed, but it's so small that it doesn't show up on the chart. Interesting, the biggest winner in that big blue bar was wireless providers who claim that they can provide 25.3. There are actually some wireless providers claim that they can provide 100 megabit service. which can be questionable depending on how many customers they get. The far one is by carrier type. This is my quick definition looking at the carrier name, so it may not be fully accurate, but this is wireless. There were some cable companies in that. This is the electric co-ops. So this is where the electric co-ops have said, hey, why don't we compete? We have to deploy smart meters, which require fiber. We got that fiber out there. We can offer telecom or broadband. So there are now quite a few electric co-ops that are offering telecom service. They probably have one of the lowest cost profiles for deploying broadband, much better than Comcast, much better than AT&T. And it's for the mere fact that they have telephone poles for their electric service, they have conduit for their electric service, they have some fiber in their network for their electric service, so they're able to leverage. And that's one of the issues when you go back to the state side, some of the states are looking to that issue of should a regulated monopoly company be able to leverage that capability to compete in a competitive market? Is it fair? And how do you allocate the cost is another issue. I think the Tennessee Valley Authority requires that the electric co-ops, if I remember correctly, actually have to spin off the fiber company. So there are certain entities that may require that spin-off. So I provide that CAF to it. It's old. The recipients started getting that money in 2019. I'll talk about what that means from a regulatory perspective for the incumbent carriers who lost those footprints at the end. So the next issue is net neutrality. This is, for the years I've been here, I probably talked about net neutrality before. It's a big issue. Under Democratic administrations, typically they push for net neutrality, which means the incumbent carriers, the Charters, the Comcast, the AT&Ts, have to provide a neutral internet. Anybody can get over that. There are no speed benefits, any of that, with the concept that it's to encourage the deployment of services. The carriers argue that requires me to invest a lot in my network. I don't have control. I don't get the proper return. When Republican administrations come in, with the last one, they changed what the Obama administration did, which was they said there is net neutrality. The Trump administration removed that. It went to court. The good thing for the carriers was the court ruled in favor of the FCC, allowing them to do net neutrality. The bad thing, though, was they left the door open for potential application at the state level. So some states, such as California, are looking at potentially requiring net neutrality within the state. And the court did not say you can't do that. So that's one of the concerns with the net neutrality. Now let me move on to RDOF. Some people call it RUDOF. There's different acronyms for it. I just use the RDOF. It's the Remote Digital Opportunity Fund. It's a replacement for that CAF funding that the price cap carriers get, which I showed you, the CenturyLink money, the AT&T money, the Windstream money, all will be put into a bucket. The FCC will auction that off for a 10-year period. So you get the money over 10 years, equal amounts in each year for 10 years. It's a $20 billion fund. So whereas the CAF 2 auction that happened in 2018 was a $2 billion fund, this is 10 times bigger. The footprint available for auction is much more enticing because it's, for the most part, most of AT&T's footprint that has been funded, or all of AT&T's footprint, all of CenturyLink's footprint are out for auction in this fund, but it's the ones that were funded previously. They're going to break it up into 2 phases. The first phase will likely occur this year. The FCC is really pushing this. Some call it political, that they want to get a win in before the elections. So they will likely have this start in August, September, so that the results are coming back before November. The first phase will be $16 billion over 10 years. It will be those census blocks that are currently reported as unserved, which is under 25.3 in the current 477. They will then have a phase 2 auction, which is post-DODC, which is the Digital Opportunity Data Collection effort. And I'll talk you through the DODC. We've been involved in the proceeding, but basically they're trying to get 477 coverage sub-census block. People have complained for years that the 477 is a flawed program because it only requires CenturyLink, I'll pick on Amy. If they have one customer in a census block, they can say the full census block is served, and that then is removed from funding potentiality, it's removed from competitive analysis, and politicians are heavily involved in this now. There's actually been broadband mapping proceedings in Congress. I actually testified in 2019 at a mapping proceeding in which Congress was really concerned about this one served, all served. And we had a 4-hour discussion on shapefiles. So you've got this panel of Congress, and actually it's 2 or 3 because they go out of the room. They only come on when the TV's on them. And we're talking about shapefiles. And I probably in a hearing said 99% of the people in the room didn't even know what a shapefile is. But they're arguing. They're all arguing about shapefiles. But anyway, that's what we'll talk about the DODC. So what's eligible in this phase 1? First, it's the census blocks that are not receiving 25.3 as of the FCC's latest 477. It is those census blocks currently receiving CAF funding if they are not getting 25.3. It's also got some additional rules. There's like 8 or 10 different classifications of what to throw into it. We're still trying to estimate what blocks are available for that fund. The FCC will probably release those census blocks mid-summer for parties to start looking at it. But they're adding to it is those census blocks not previously funded because their cost, as we estimate it, was under $52.50 a month. The FCC is now saying if the cost in that census block is at $40 and they still are not getting 25.3, those will also go out for auction. And in Native American areas and areas not receiving 10.1, they're going to drop it down to $30. So they're adding to this collection additional census blocks out for auction. The process that they'll run through is similar to the CAF2 reverse auction. There are some adjustments to it. I'll highlight just a few of those. It will use the CACA model, which is the FCC's internal cost model, to set that reserve price. So here's what is available in that census block. They've removed the lowest speed tier. Interesting enough, in that prior effort, 10.1 was allowed. In the CAF2 funding that's currently provided, 10.1 is allowed, but the FCC for years has defined broadband as 25 megabit or more. So they've been funding and setting up programs that actually don't deploy what the FCC calls as broadband, but the money was for broadband. So just try and think through that. But they're going to raise the lowest speed tier that you can bid at 25.3. They added an intermediate one of 55. And they also modified the clearing round, which is that first phase. So as I get down to, I've spent my $20 billion, if there is a gigabit provider and a 100 megabit provider, the gigabit provider automatically wins. So there will be no continued bidding amongst those. So that's some of the major changes. You can see they've modified the weighting. The minimum, the 25.3 now is at 50. I think before it was at 45. The above baseline was at 15, it's now at 20. So again, there was a number of congressmen and senators complained to the FCC, said, you can't set this fund up unless it encourages technologies that will be future-proof. And that's in part why they removed the 10 and why they're providing additional encouragement to that gigabit tier. They've also bumped up the latency. So again, satellite companies start off with a 90% penalty. So again, they're trying to, they can't specify technology. They cannot do that. but what they can do is set it up to encourage a technology, and that's what they're trying to do. So that map is our initial estimate. This was based upon the first RDOF order that came out, the draft order. They've since released a new one about 2 weeks ago. We're still trying to figure out what census blocks across the country are available, but it's all the green. And you can see geographically, it's a big part of the country. Population-wise, not so. Population-wise, it's about 6 million locations or buildings. And if you think about population, that may be 12 to 15 million Americans will get funded through this program. These are the early estimates from the FCC how many locations will be available in all the states. There are 2 states that aren't in that, Alaska, because they have their own special fund, and New York. New York received and took the CAF money to run their own auction, and the FCC said, you took the money, you're done. So now New York is complaining that they're not actually eligible for this money. But this is what will go out for auction. If you're interested, I talked about, I think, linear density early on. We wrote a paper about the economic issues in rural America, and it's all driven by linear density. And again, I said it's for water networks, electric networks, road networks. You have to have some kind of funding for these networks in rural America. What we find is typically under a linear density of a 15, you just can't deploy. There is no economic payback for the network because you don't have the ability to get enough ARPU or revenue to cover the cost incurred in that network. So if you look at it, that yellow is what parts of the country have a linear density under 15, which is the majority of the country. If you look at, and I won't pick on my cable brethren here, but if you look at what the cable companies typically serve, it's the dark orange. They have typically in their franchise agreements that they don't have to serve densities under a certain level, so they typically haven't deployed into the yellow. But that's really the linear density of the country. This side is the fiber to the perm. It's a new term that we're using instead of prem. Maybe that was a misspelling on the slide. Yeah, you gotta look good. But this is the relative cost, our estimate of relative cost of deploying. The white sections are either unpopulated or their cost is under $50 a month. $50 a month, you potentially can make an economic return on it. Once you get above the 50, which are the colors that you see here, it becomes fairly expensive. And you can see the most expensive parts of the country with cost of in excess of $500 a month are in the western portion of the country. Some of that is CenturyLink footprint. That's their footprint and what they have to serve. The problem will be CenturyLink will still have to serve these areas. The money that made up that gap will be auctioned off. So what happens to the value of that CenturyLink network in Colorado, forget my western states, Montana, all those states out there. So now let me move on to the DODC. The DODC, we've been involved in this. This is a potential replacement for the 477. The 477, all broadband providers have to file information at the FCC in which census blocks they provide service and at what speeds. And as Larry indicated before, Larry would like to see them provide additional speed tiers so that he can track the deployment of these higher speed networks going into the future. What the FCC is going to do is going to move below the census block level. We were involved in a proceeding to help encourage the FCC to actually go to address level. Let the carriers file the addresses at which they serve, and then that is the 477. So that was kind of the telecom perspective. The cable perspective was, let's just file polygon or shapefiles. And that's really what drove the FCC. The FCC said, let's do shapefiles. They're easier to do, and we can get this done quickly. And that's really what the congressional proceeding was about, was these coverage polygons. Do we require that in legislation? They actually have legislation written and it will likely be approved potentially in January, maybe in January. It depends on if other things clear out of Congress. There's some stuff going on in Congress right now that I think is just burdening the ability to get pushed through. It will be used to guide the RDOF auction. It is a tie to actually what we developed was the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric. We did a proof of concept in Missouri and Virginia in which we identified the latitude and longitude of every building in the state. You would think that there's a database out there that has this. There's not. When carriers talk about the addresses they file at, they have the address. They may try and geocode that address. Geocoding tools estimate where that may be, and sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not so good. So what we developed is actually we took, we've got all the parcels in those states. Actually, we have them countrywide, all the tax assessor data, and we have a database of 170 million building polygons. So a satellite firm has actually digitized the boundaries of every building in the country. We bashed all that together to come up with that fabric that may be part of that process. The funny thing is my partner Mark gave us the name Fabric to use. Fabric is now in the legislation that the Congress is going to adopt. They want a national fabric. So it's just interesting that we were able to influence the name that they used in the legislation that is going to come out. So these are slides that I actually presented in Congress to actually help people really understand what this means. These are 10 census blocks in rural Missouri, central part of the state, I forget which county. But these are census block shapes. Census block shapes range from a city block in urban areas, they're very small. In rural America, they can be quite large. And they are the unit of geography that most governments use to track demographics, to run an auction, they use census blocks. To run the FCC 477, you just have to report which of those census blocks do I serve. And lo and behold, when we took this sample, those 10, there's actually more than 10. There's some really weird census blocks that show up, a little circle out in the farmer's field up here. But for the majority 10, these would have been reported in today's 477 as served. What the FCC wants to do is they want to dive below that. So we actually, in our proof of concept that we ran, we collected address level information from the carriers in the state of Missouri, and they said, these are the ones we serve, which are the green dots. The red dots are addresses that they did not serve. So you can see this odd shaped census block is reported as served to the FCC, but the carriers really only serve the western portion of that census block. So these people out here, call their politicians and they say, I can't get service. People come back and say, well, the census block is served. And that's really what creates the political backlash is politicians are hearing about this from people who say, they're telling me I'm served, but I cannot get service. So the FCC is looking at polygons. They've not defined what a polygon is yet. So that's what the DODC order is about, is let's create what a polygon means. I won't make fun of my cable compatriots, but the cable company coalition said, let's not define it. Just let the carriers define their own and just file it. So it's just kind of like a big party of here's all these polygons, and you don't know how to interpret it. That's the problem. If you don't have standards, and standards about coverage is a big issue. We found that in the wireless side. So if you look at the 477 coverage for wireless carriers, I won't make fun of T-Mobile or AT&T, but sometimes they overestimate their coverage footprint into 477. So if you don't have standards, and that's what the FCC is trying to do, how do you get polygons that you can actually use? And that's what we really push for, is just some standards about it. So these are, we call these pearls, just because they look like little pearls. And basically it's a 150-foot buffer about all the known address points that you serve, and that now is the polygon. If you have the underlying fabric, which is all those points, I can now know how many people are unserved. That's what we don't know right now. In these census blocks, who is unserved? We don't know. And that's what this effort is really about. These are other polygons. These are road-based polygons, so I can take a road segment, buffer about them 150 feet in each direction, say these are the areas that are served. These are just bigger road polygons. So again, this is what the FCC is considering in the DODC order. What will happen is once the polygons are filed by the carriers, we will then have what is available for that phase 2 part of the auction, that $4 billion auction, will then fund those ports of the census block. Just the last couple items. USDA has about $700 million annually that they offer through their RUS programs. They're typically in the farm bills. There was a $600 million additional bucket of money that was allotted in 2019 for the Reconnect grants. Those were offered by the USDA. I think about 300 and some million was actually awarded out. And then, as I said, US Congress has a bill ready to pass to improve broadband mapping and create the national broadband fabric. So now let me just finish up with how this might impact the valuation of the telecom carriers, not the cable carriers, because they're really not impacted by this RDOF auction. It's the AT&Ts, the CenturyLinks, the Windstreams. So if you look at the service obligations, on the federal side, telecom carriers had an ETC obligation because they provided voice service. ETC stands for Eligible Telecommunication Carrier. What that required was in that area they had to provide voice service because they were getting federal funding. Actually, because they were the telecom carrier. And in that area they had to provide Lifeline and Link-Up services. Lifeline and Link-Up are for people in poverty level get credits on their phone bills. So that's what the ETC thing at the federal side did. On the state side, there is an ETC requirement as well on the state level. The states also had what they call as the COLR, the carrier of last resort, in which the carrier, the telecom carrier, had to be able to provide facility connections to customers who requested it. Even if I didn't have facilities there today, someone could call up and say, I want service. CenturyLink would actually have to run network facilities out to provide to them. What happened with the ETC side is the ETC was removed from the incumbent carriers in non-CAF funded blocks. So AT&T, the vast number of customers they have are on non-CAF blocks. The FCC said you're no longer an ETC, so they no longer have to follow those obligations. Many carriers have been encouraging their state regulatory agencies to remove the COLR. So COLR has been removed in a number of states for these carriers as well. So the obligations for that incumbent carrier are being relaxed except for one. And that is the Section 214. Under the Section 214 service discontinuation process, a local exchange carrier cannot turn off POTS service without notice and approval and a demonstration that there are no longer any POTS customers in that area. So, as the CAF 2 auction took place, the first one that ended in 2019, AT&T released everything in Missouri, but they are still under Section 214. So they still have to provide POTS service to anybody that requests that until they get the allowance provided by the FCC. So is that property, does it have some obsolescence associated with it? You would think so, because now there is a competitive carrier who will be providing I don't want to say a better service, higher speed service to those customers. Most likely they'll be losing customer after customer, but they will not be relieved of that network responsibility until all customers leave and they file under Section 214. The hope was in this RDOF auction that they would put that into the wording of the RDOF auction, that when the RDOF blocks got awarded out, 214 would be relieved. It did not make it into the language. So again, as CenturyLink's footprint is being auctioned off, there's going to be issues about obsolescence in that footprint. And this is some additional language, you can look at it before, but this is where the ETC obligation was removed in those CAF blocks that would be awarded out. So I'm sorry for running over a little bit, but any questions? Yes? Yeah, the January 30th is the point at which they believe the RDOF order will be adopted, which will then set up this auction for the $16 billion. So there is a vote scheduled on January 30th.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Seems like this next round, the next two rounds are going to really encourage the higher speeds and really encourage fiber. Is that a correct?
Yes, yes, that's our intent.
And that would put a lot of pressure on the more rural carriers providing basically service on metallic cable.
Yes, it will. We've been contacted by some electric co-op coalitions who want to form together to form a bidding coalition to go after this money. Their expectation is they will deploy fiber networks. Yeah.
Do you have any estimate about what percentage of those customers that are, say, underserved in terms of broadband speeds might be affected by this?
We can get that. We could use the RDOF, the first CAF 2 auction, to see kind of what was awarded out, to try and determine how we could estimate in this new RDOF auction what percent of the customers will get a gig, what percent will get 100 megabit.
Right. Do you think it'll be a big number or?
I think it'll be a big number as far as the deployment of fiber in rural America. You know, maybe half or maybe a quarter to a half will get at least 100 megabit service of those 6 million locations. So
Right.
yeah.
And 6 million locations be a pretty big chunk. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Gary?
Yeah, so are those rural co-ops rate regulated? And if so, are they getting, maybe you know?
Depends on the state.
Yeah,
In Missouri, they're not rate regulated. You go into Arkansas, they are under their PSC.
Yeah. Yeah, it depends. And in like Tennessee, they're under the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority on rate regulation. They're rate regulated on the electric side. On the telecom side, it can be a kind of a maybe or maybe not.
So if they're rate regulated, then would they even be eligible for a subsidy? Because theoretically, they could pass that through.
That is a good question. And the other question is, if they're rate regulated, how do you determine the cost that's associated with their fiber service?
Right.
Because that, you know, all their poles have already been paid for. They're already funded. So it gives them an advantage, but you need to allocate kind of like a transfer pricing. What's the value of the pole used in that exercise? And that's, I think, what some of the regulatory agencies are looking at.
So on the state obligations, do those go away even if the ATC regulation goes away for, so like the COLA at the state level? So do they both go away or just one? And then second question was, what happens to CenturyLink and Frontier when they just announced that they weren't able to hit their targets for like over half their states on the CAF build-outs?
Yeah, so I'll hit the second one first, and then I'll forget about the first one. So on the CAF build-outs, part of the funding that the carriers get is they have to meet certain targets year by year, and if they don't hit those targets, they actually get penalized and money gets taken back from them. So it's a financial imperative that they get these built out, and if they can't do that, then they have to go into the FCC and ask for forgiveness and ask that they be given some additional time, and that's what's currently going on there. On the first part, I told you I'd forgive. The first part was the...
Whether you lose the ATC.
Oh, yeah, on the state side, that's the other issue is the states don't necessarily have to follow the FCC rules, that as they remove you from ETC obligations, state doesn't have to remove you from ETC or COLA. You have to go in and get that yourselves with the states, and AT&T has been quite successful in getting ETC and COLA removed. I don't know about CenturyLink, but it is something that they have to fight at the state regulatory agencies to say, there's another provider here, you need to relieve me of these obligations. Some states say that if more than half the customers, or if more than half the customers in a small geographic area have access to a competitive network, you can be relieved of it. But it depends state by state.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good information.